Hi, and welcome to Bard Talks. Today we have a very special presentation from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust by Dr. Nick Walton. I'm Jewel, your host. If at any point you have questions about this webinar or the rest of our series, you can email me at jewel@shakespearecenter.org. Our April series of Bard Talks has some very exciting additions. On April 13th, we will have Bill Kincaid, the author of Performing Shakespeare Unrehearsed, which will address rehearsal practices for Elizabethan plays. On April 20th, we have Francine Segan, food historian and author of Shakespeare's Kitchen. On April 27th, we have Louis Fantasia, the Director of Education at Shakespeare Globe Center and now the head of the Shakespeare Institute here at the Shakespeare Center of Los Angeles. Registration links for each of these webinars will be sent out the week prior. If you missed any of our past webinars on Antony and Cleopatra, you can access them on the member archive. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can go to the shakespearecenter.org. We have several staged readings coming up in the next few months, including Love's Labour's Lost on Sunday, April 28th at 3 p.m., Cymbeline, Sunday, September 22nd at 3 p.m., and Twelfth Night on Sunday, December 8th at 3 p.m. You can get discount tickets to the staged reading of Love's Labour's Lost by using the discount code below. Join us at the Love's Labour's Lost reading for our big reveal of our summer show. The big announcement will happen at 2:30 on April 28th, right before the Love's Labour's Lost reading. Next up for Bard Talks is a series on Cymbeline. On August 24th, we'll have Dr. Maureen McDonald, September 7th, Julia Lipton, September 14th, Francis Dolan, and September 24th, Dr. Anja Chauhan from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Because you attended live, you'll be entered to win 2 free tickets to the staged reading of Love's Labour's Lost. The winners will be informed via email after the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you so much for your support of the Shakespeare Center of Los Angeles. The Shakespeare Center of Los Angeles engages audience of all ages by creating award-winning theatrical productions and life-changing art employment for chronically unemployed, military veterans, and Los Angeles' most vulnerable youth. These webinars and the readings are presented to engage lifelong learners and to build awareness and support for our distinctive programs. If you're interested in donating, please go to shakespearecenter.org for more information. We have several exciting opportunities for educators coming up this summer, including our Shakespeare Institute. After each of our stage reading series, we hold a professional development workshop. For more information, you can go to the Professional Development tab on our website. And now, we hope you enjoy this presentation by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust.
The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is all about bringing Shakespeare to life, and that's for everybody. Whether you're a lifelong Shakespearean expert or whether it's the first encounter with Shakespeare, we're all about making those experiences come alive and be really meaningful for people. We're a charity, we don't get any regular government funding, so we're really reliant on every volunteer, every visitor, every donor. There's something really important about experiencing history where it happened. There's a feeling that you can get in the pit of your stomach when you're in the real place, seeing the real thing. And coming to Stratford does that for people. We've got this collection which consists of the Shakespeare family homes. So there's 5 houses that were connected with Shakespeare and his immediate family. The streets he would have walked on, places that he would have walked.
The joy you get when you take somebody new down, open up a box in the archives, and the excitement that they see, because they're seeing it for the first time, reminds you of why it's so important for us and so special for us to be working with these collections. That direct connection back to Shakespeare the man is what people really like when they come to Stratford. Things like the parish register, where people can feel that direct connection back to Shakespeare. There's his baptism record, there's him being recorded in the world for the first time, if you like. The other artefact that really sort of resonates with visitors and makes them sort of take stock and go, wow, is something like the first folio. This is the book where the plays appear together for the first time, and without that book we'd have lost sort of 18 of them in the mists of time. So there's a number of different challenges that face us here looking after these collections. There's obviously the scale of them, and that the fact that they continue to grow means that storage is an ever increasing issue, and each of those items needs to be catalogued. We might want to digitise it to make it available to our audiences, not just here in Stratford but around the world. And then we might want to conserve certain artefacts to make sure that they survive not for the next year, next 5 years, but forevermore.
I'm standing on the site of New Place, Shakespeare's final home in Stratford-upon-Avon. Beneath my feet is the area where Shakespeare would have lived with his family, his 2 daughters, his wife. It is a place where we encourage all of our visitors to make their own personal connection with Shakespeare, the man, the writer, possibly the greatest writer the world has ever seen.
I was doing some guiding in the birth room, and I was talking to a Chinese student, and she clearly was very, very moved. And she said at one point, could she say a Chinese blessing? So I said, yes, of course you can. So she stood at the bottom of the bed, and then she started to cry. And she finished, and she bowed, and she said, thank you for giving the world William Shakespeare.
I think the unifying theme through all the work we do is that we encourage people to make their own connections, to make their own discoveries, and conversation. Whether it's with a 7-year-old who's heard a word of Shakespeare for the first time, or whether it's with that 90-year-old who's been going to see plays for 50 years. For us, it's about making sure that people not only understand, but they also enjoy. There is something there for everybody, whether it's a touching point with a human story that's been told and a way of expressing an emotion that you've felt but not being able to voice for yourself, or whether it's just actually the pure excitement of learning about historical characters. Our work is to actually make sure that people can find that connection.
Hello theatre people in Los Angeles. I'm Nick Walton and I work here in Stratford-upon-Avon at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. I run residential courses for high school and university students and also work a great deal with the general public. I've got a great job because I get to watch lots of Shakespeare's plays at the theatre and I get to chat with students about the performances. So I get to hear their interpretations and get to hear how the plays had an impact upon them and their lives. Now, I gather that you're all interested in Love's Labour's Lost right now, so I thought I'd take a few moments to tell you a little bit about the play's performance history and also about some of the productions that there have been here in Stratford in recent years of that play. Love's Labour's Lost, you will often hear being referred to as one of the most beautiful of Shakespeare's comedies, but you're just as likely to hear it being referred to as a challenging play. I've even heard people refer to it as a connoisseur's play, and I find that a bit off-putting. I think it gets that reputation because of the language. And I think for a lot of readers over the centuries, the language has seemed quite arcane, seemed quite outdated. I'm sure you've found that already in reading the drama. But of course, it's very deliberately so. Shakespeare's making the language very ornate, very elaborate, very sophisticated, because in part he's satirising the use of language in his own period. You'll know that Shakespeare was living during a remarkable time of change for the English language. Language was in an incredible state of flux, because there were thousands of words that were being added to people's vocabulary, whilst other words were dropping out of fashion. and some completely falling out of usage. I think it must have been a really self-conscious moment as people used words because they started to define who they were, what they were. And I think this play captures that idea of self-consciousness of language usage. Now, that sense of difficulty surrounding the language can be quite off-putting for actors, because I think actors will often think, well, what if the audience don't understand what I'm saying? Of course, that's the last thing any performer would ever want to be the case. Kenneth Branagh is a huge admirer of the work, and he's actually performed here in Stratford as the king years before he went on to play Barone in his own movie of the play. Now, he has this to say about the play's language.
The play is full of rhymed line endings. Verbally or musically, it is a great feast of language. This presents some difficulties for actors and producers. They have to decide whether to play the language to the hilt, knowing that because it is so dense, the audience isn't necessarily going to pick up everything, or whether to slow it down a bit in order to try to give away as much of the meaning as possible. This may be a reason why the play has been neglected since Shakespeare's day, really until this century.
You'll probably remember that in the play there's that funny moment when Constable Dull says that he's hardly understood a word that Nathaniel and Holofernes have been saying. And of course, no actor would ever want their audience to be feeling in the same state of ignorance. And I think what you'll find is actually this play proves far more accessible on the stage than it sometimes does on the page. I was lucky enough to have my first encounter with Love's Labour's Lost through performing in it. I was cast as Don Armado, which is an absolute gift for an actor, and it was lovely to be on stage and to look out at audiences really enjoying this play and feeling its rhythms and identifying the moments of comedy, even if they didn't necessarily understand every word that they heard. I think it's a great play for performance, and it's a great play for an ensemble of performers. This play has got lots of great roles. Obviously, Barone has the lion's share of lines at something like 22%, but being an ensemble piece, it really relies upon all of the characters supporting one another. The play is almost symmetrical in its design. And I think what you'll find is all of those supporting roles really add to the audience's enjoyment. And you're as likely to walk away from a production of this play remembering the performance of Holofernes, Nathaniel, Moth, or perhaps Costard, as you are Barone, the King, or the Princess of France. So it's a great, great play for an ensemble. The last time that it was performed here in Stratford was in 2014, and it was performed as part of a double bill. So Love's Labour's Lost was performed alongside Much Ado About Nothing. Except for this season, Much Ado About Nothing was renamed Love's Labour's 1, hence the double bill. Now, you've probably heard of Love's Labour's 1 because we have a reference to it in 1598, when Francis Mears writes and speaks about a list of Shakespeare's plays, and he mentions both Love's Labour's Lost and Love's Labour's 1. This has led some people to believe that there is either a play in existence called Love's Labour's 1 at the time that is now lost, or perhaps it was another name for a play that we do now know. So perhaps Much Ado About Nothing was also known as Love's Labour's 1. It would be a little bit like Twelfth Night, which also goes by the name What You Will. So the RSC decided to put both shows on. They had the same company of actors in both productions, which allowed you to hear some of the echoes between the two plays. There are lots of similarities, both in terms of stagecraft, but also in terms of characterisation. It wasn't that we were supposed to imagine that the same characters were in both plays, we were just invited to hear the similarities. They set the production in 1914. So what you had was the idea that at the end of the play, the young men were going off to the First World War. And there was a very poignant moment when the lovers parted and we heard the beating of a drum and watched these young men leave the stage dressed in their military uniform. Would they ever see one another again? Would there be any hope for this love that had started to blossom during the course of the play? If you went to the theatre the next night to see Much Ado About Nothing, or Love's Labour's Won, as it was called, you started with the soldiers returning from war, because of course that's how Much Ado About Nothing begins. And then you sensed an arc between these two plays that actually, by the end of Much Ado, gave you the comedic ending that you're hoping for with all of those marriages. So Love's Labour's Lost, becoming part of a double bill, it was an important historic moment in the play's performance history, and it's interesting to wonder whether that will ever be done again. Although Love's Labour's Lost is sometimes referred to today as a connoisseur's play, and that's partly because of all of the allusions that are packed into it and some of the topical references, we do know that in Shakespeare's time the play was very popular, and you'll have found already that the play is stuffed full with taffeta phrases and silken terms precise. And this has led some scholars to believe that the play would have been very popular with courtly, educated, somewhat elite audiences. Probably those audiences that would have paid to go and watch the plays at the indoor theatres, like Blackfriars, a little later in Shakespeare's career. We also know that the play was performed in front of Queen Elizabeth I. It was performed at Christmas time, and the reason that we know this is it's recorded on the front page of the first quarto, which was produced in 1598. As well as the Queen enjoying it, I think it would have been very popular with actors, because we know that Shakespeare's great tragedian, Richard Burbage, actually recommended the play for performance for Queen Anne, who was James I's wife, and that was performed in 1604. And a little after that, we have records of the play being performed in Blackfriars in 1608. And a few performances beyond that date. So, some 10 years after the play was written, the play continued to be popular with theatre audiences. But all of that changed after Shakespeare's death. The play went out of date very quickly and soon seemed old-fashioned. Those taffeta phrases were no longer the taste of audiences going to the theatre beyond the 1660s. And by 1817, the critic William Hazlitt was able to write that if we were to part with any of Shakespeare's comedies, it would be this one. And I think that's an interesting thing to say by that point. It makes me imagine sitting in a rowing boat that's starting to sink, and you've got lots of editions of Shakespeare's plays on board, and you're tossing them over the side one by one to remain afloat. Which of the plays would you toss away first? I think William Hazlitt would have got rid of Love's Labour's Lost pretty quickly. The reason that the play was proving a little outdated and a little unfashionable was, of course, because theatre itself was changing. So the play disappeared for something like 200 years, and the next performances reappear in the 1840s. But the text by that point is being filleted. There isn't much text left, and they're filling the play with songs and with dances and making room for lots of visual spectacle in the design. So the play really does begin to change, and by the start of the 20th century, it still doesn't have very many admirers. The influential director and actor Harley Granville Barker was an advocate for the play. He said this about it.
Here is a fashionable play, now by 300 years out of fashion, nor did it ever, one supposes, make a very wide appeal. It abounds in jokes for the elect. Were you not numbered among them, you laughed for safety in the likeliest places. A year or two later, the elect themselves might be hard put to it to remember what the joke was.
In recent years, the play has proved more and more popular in the theatre, and I put this down in part to Kenneth Branagh's film of the play, which I'm sure many of you've seen. It was produced in the year 2000, and Branagh gave the play the full Hollywood treatment. So it was turned essentially into a Hollywood musical, and they inserted songs by George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, and Cole Porter. And it was a fantastically showy and elegant film to match the showy, elegant language that Shakespeare writes. Branagh actually set it, you might remember, in 1939. So at the end of the play, the young men were heading off towards the Second World War, and there was a question over whether they would return. And that's something that a number of productions have gone and done in recent years. Another production that I think proved very popular with audiences, certainly here in Stratford, was a production that was directed by Michael Kahn. The production came here in Stratford in 2006 when the Royal Shakespeare Company mounted a complete works festival. Essentially, in the space of 1 year, you could see all of Shakespeare's plays being performed in Stratford, some by the RSC and all the rest by visiting companies from around the world. It was an incredible season. And I remember Michael Kahn's production very well because he set it in the 1960s, and the young men looked not unlike the Beatles when they were going off to India in search of spiritual enlightenment. And Kahn completely redressed the play. So instead of appearing as Muscovites, the young lovers dressed themselves as cosmonauts, and then rather than writing sonnets, they all wrote pop songs. And they suddenly revealed instruments that were hidden around the stage to compose these songs upon. And slowly, by the end of the scene, they were all jamming together. I really remember it as a great moment of theatre. As the plays got more and more performances, it started to become more familiar to audiences, and its popularity has risen. And I was quite struck that I read recently that the theatre critic Michael Billington has written a new book, and it's called The 101 Greatest Plays from Antiquity to the Modern Day. And he has actually included Love's Labour's Lost amongst his 101 greatest plays. King Lear isn't in there. Othello isn't in there. A Midsummer Night's Dream isn't in there, but Love's Labour's Lost is. And Michael Billington says his reason for including that play is, for him, it shows the first full flourishing of Shakespeare's genius. He really admires the stagecraft of the play, and he's particularly admiring of the closing moments of the drama. He says that the play has one of the most sensational entrances in the whole of world drama.
God save you, madam.
Welcome, Mercade, but that thou interruptest our merriment.
I am sorry, madam, for the news I bring is heavy in my tongue. The king, your father,
Dead for my life.
even so, my tale is told.
Shakespeare's doing something really different at the end of this play with the entrance of Mercade. I think whenever we're watching a Shakespeare comedy, we're so used to the play moving towards a sense of harmony, a sense of unity, a sense of reconciliation, everything coming together and looking forward to a happy future. But Shakespeare really pulls the rug from underneath our feet with the end of this play. You'll remember right at the start of the play, you do actually hear about the Princess of France's father. We hear that he's decrepit, he's sick, and he's bedrid. So we have this sense of his illness, and it casts something of a shadow over the start of the play. But then it disappears. We don't hear any more about her father, and we're left to enjoy time with these young, spirited individuals until the entrance of Mercade. When Mercade enters, we suddenly have the whole of the frivolity of the performance of the Nine Worthies being brought to a shuddering close. Essentially, Mercade's news punctures the scene. We've had lots of activity, lots of energy, lots of laughs from the audience, and then that chilling news just stops everything. You'll probably also think about Hamlet. If you think about Shakespeare's stagecraft there, when Gertrude comes onto stage to announce the death of Ophelia, it has a very similar effect. Suddenly, Laertes and Claudius are silenced. Here in Love's Labour's Lost, it's the princess who's silenced and everybody else. And Barone says that the scene begins to cloud. What a fantastic line. I think it's one of those moments in Shakespeare's plays where suddenly everything transforms. People's lives are turned upside down. And it's quite interesting that the plain, honest words that Macade uses really just silence the young men. They've been using all sorts of flowery language. They've been actually behaving quite dreadfully during the performance of the Nine Worthies. But this sudden burst of reality and the shock news of a death suddenly makes everybody stand to attention. And Shakespeare brings in that wonderful technique that he has at the close, where he actually postpones the end of this play. We've got to look forward to their meeting a year from now. Barone actually says it's not ending like a play, Jack hath not Jill. And I think we've got a feeling that the young men have got to go away, grow up, find themselves in the world, and then perhaps there'll be time for the young women to talk to them once again. The entrance of Macade can be done very differently from production to production, and I thought I'd just let you know about a couple of productions in Stratford that have been very influential in shaping the way that that moment has been approached in subsequent performances. The first of the productions is one from 1946, and it was directed by Peter Brook. It was actually Peter Brook's first production that he'd done here in Stratford. He was only 21 at the time, and the reviewers thought it was an absolute sensation. It started, I think, in quite an interesting way. It began with a mime. So if you can imagine, 4 young women raced onto the stage and they read the proclamation that the king had left for everybody. It was painted on the backcloth of the theatre. So they were reading the proclamation, and then Constable Dull came chasing onto stage and took them away. So that's how the play opened. The look, the design, the set for the production was very notable indeed, and Peter Brook said he found something painterly about Love's Labour's Lost. He actually looked to the paintings of Jean-Antoine Watteau as his inspiration. Here's a description of the production so you can get a sense of what it looked like.
When I studied the text of Love's Labour's Lost, I was struck by something that seemed to me to be self-evident, but which at the time seemed to be unheard of, that when, at the very end of the last scene, a new, unexpected character called Macade came on, the whole play changed its tone entirely. He came into an artificial world to announce a piece of news that was real. He came on, bringing death. And as I felt intuitively that the image of the Watteau world was very close to this, I began to see that the reason that the Watteau Age of Gold is so particularly moving is that although it's a picture of springtime, it's an autumn springtime, because every one of Watteau's pictures has an incredible melancholy. And if one looks, one sees that there is somewhere in it the presence of death, until one even sees that in Watteau there is usually a dark figure somewhere standing with his back to you. And some people say that he is Watteau himself. Once Moth revealed that Armado cherished Jacquenetta's dishclout, the preparations for the fight began. Costard practiced warming-up exercises, aimed a water pistol at Armado, was chased by Armado, and finally produced Pompey's sword to use for the fight. Armado went up the steps, chased by Costard, and then the dueling pair fought their way down the stairs. Attention moved down centre and slightly left at the base of the steps where Armado and Costard were fighting, while the rest of the cast had spread out to give the combatants some room. Thus, when Macade entered from up centre, coming over the mound, he was virtually unnoticed, although as he moved down centre, space cleared around him. The 1947 prompt book reads, "Dead silence and still."
And here's Peter Brook describing that moment himself.
The man in black came onto a very pretty summery stage, with everybody in pastel, watteau and lancre costumes, and golden lights dying. It was very disturbing, and at once the whole audience felt that the world had been transformed.
That prolonged silence, either during the moment when McCabe is speaking or just after he's left the stage, is something that has actually come to be a commonplace in productions today. So many productions look back to Peter Brooks and can't help but reference that moment in one way or another. The other production I want to tell you about is a production from 1978, and it was directed by John Barton. He too had a very interesting way of introducing McCabe at the close of the play. To get an idea of the production, here's a description which will tell you a little bit about the autumnal feel for this particular show.
Enormous boughs of cascading autumnal leaves entirely enclosing a raked wooden forestage, behind which seats and a leaf-strewn floor suggested distant parkland. But there was no external glamour about the two courts, which seemed humbler, less formal than usual. The lords took their oaths with little ceremony on a rustic seat. Rosaline cleaned the princess's travelling boots and the travel-stained hem of her skirt in their first scene, and swept up autumn leaves with a broom in the last. The king and the princess, especially, were very unelaborated, untidy even in appearance, ordinary human beings rather than heads of state, especially when they first met, a rather endearing, unimpressive, bespectacled pair. A long silence indicated sudden, to them embarrassing, mutual attraction.
As you can hear, John Barton broke away somewhat from tradition by focusing upon the characters of the King and the Princess of France, just as much as the characters of Baronne and Rosaline. And if that's of interest to you, here's a description about the first encounter between the King and the Princess in this production.
Carmen du Sautoy's princess and Richard Griffith's king are obviously meant for each other, and they fell in love almost at first sight. When she says, "Suddenly resolved me in my suit," she holds out the letter, and there is a long pause. He fumbles for words. "Madam, I will, if suddenly I may." And her answer, completely without sarcasm, sounds as if she is struggling to put words together. "You will the sooner that I were away." Characteristically, as the king reaches out for the letter from her father, she accidentally drops it. Both she and the king bend over to pick up the letter. The princess gets it and hands it over to him, but both are embarrassed by the small mishap. He turns away to read the letter, while she turns away and takes off her glasses. The immediate falling in love of these two slightly clumsy and unromantic-looking people becomes very touching and creates a gentle tone for their relationship.
John Barton and his company found a really interesting way to help McCabe get onto stage in a way that he wasn't actually visible to the audience. So it was a complete shock and surprise when they actually were aware of his presence. There was all of the activity that was surrounding the performance of the Nine Worthies. So bodies all over the stage, a hive of activity and action. And then McCabe made his entrance hidden behind all of those different performers. Here's quite a long description to give you a sense of exactly how the choreography worked for it on stage. It is quite long and it sounds a bit like a football report in parts, but I hope it gives you a good picture of what went on.
The frenetic atmosphere in which such behaviour seems believable has been building gradually since the beginning of the pageant. It continues to build with the challenge by Pompey and Armado, Baronne's seizing of Armado's lance, the move by Domain to help arm Costard, and the attempt by Longueville and Moth to take off Armado's shirt. On the line, since when I'll be sworn he were none but a dishclout of Jaquenetta's, and that a wears next his heart a favour, Moth pulls a dishcloth out of Armado's armour and tosses it to Costard, who throws it to Longueville. Longueville realises that they are playing keep away and tosses the cloth to Sir Nathaniel. The puzzled cleric throws it to the princess, who is standing on the bench. She doesn't know what to do with it, so she tosses it to Holofernes, who hastily throws it to Domain, who sends it back to Longueville, who tosses it upstage. And at this moment it is caught, up centre, by Marcade. The game stops as he drops the cloth disdainfully to the ground and comes down centre towards the princess, who is perched with bare feet on the bench. The pose could scarcely be less queen-like, and that is a deliberate choice. One is never prepared for death, but to be found barefoot and playing a silly game is to heighten the lack of preparation and the switch to silence. The princess steps down from the bench, trying to find a place on a full stage of people where she can be alone with her grief.
I didn't actually see this production, but I think just from that description, you come away with a really good sense of what it must have looked like, and most importantly, what it must have felt like to have been in the audience experiencing that moment. It sounds to me as though the princess would have come across as an incredibly vulnerable figure at that moment. And I think Barton's production really goes to show why it is that Michael Billington says that this is perhaps one of the most sensational entrances in the whole of world drama. Whenever I'm thinking about a Shakespeare play, I always find myself wondering what sort of advice Shakespeare would give to actors or directors looking to stage his work today. Obviously, I can't give you Shakespeare's own words of advice, but I can look to Greg Doran, who is the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and tell you some of the things that he said about this play, having directed it and cast David Tennant in the role of Baron.
It's a great company play with lots of appetizing roles. If you have a good cast, most of your work is done. It doesn't seem to me that the work of the director on this particular play is interpretive. It's really very straightforward. It doesn't want to be over-designed or have too much concept applied to it. To pitch the playfulness of the piece, to allow it to rise with lightness and air, takes a lot of work. As any master chef will tell you, a soufflé is one of the hardest dishes to bake. There isn't a great deal of significant plot, so the audience needs to be content to sit back comfortably and bask in the sheer fun of being in the company of these leisurely people.
It's been really lovely talking to you, and I hope that's been of some use, and I hope you get to come over to Stratford at some point and you can use our library, look at some of the great photos we have of productions, see Shakespeare's houses, and perhaps we can watch a play together and get to talk about it. We run residential courses for university and high school groups who get to stay in Stratford, learn about Shakespeare's plays, watch his plays in the theatre, and discover things in our wonderful archive.
The teachers are so inspiring and passionate and very well versed on Shakespeare's text and language and his plays, and I've just learned so much from them.
Being in Shakespeare's hometown actually gives you a real sense of belonging. And I love that all the people here are so interested in the time that Shakespeare was living in, and they are so passionate about preserving all his homes, all the gardens. You feel so much more like you're actually able to understand the man behind the plays, and that's what I love about all the work the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust does.
I have loved participating in the residential course here in Stratford. Every teacher seems to have this innate ability to attract a whole audience on such a personal level, and it's especially amazing to be able to experience such intensive Shakespearean literature and language right next to his childhood house.
Thank you so much for joining us, and a huge thank you to Nick Walton and the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Please join us next week for Professor Bill Kincaid's presentation on Elizabethan rehearsal practices. Have a great week.